The air in the recreation hall was thick with the ghosts of 1,000 cheap coffees. It smelled of industrial-grade pine cleaner, the sharp chemical tang failing to mask the deeper, more ingrained scent of sweat-soaked vinyl and stale popcorn. Neon signs on the walls, advertising beers no one under 21 could legally drink, buzzed with a low, insectal hum. The noise was a constant, rolling tide of youth, the boisterous laughter of young Marines, the sharp crack of pool balls colliding, the tinny beats spilling from a dozen different headphones. It was a place of transient energy, a holding pen for restless warriors between duties. In the midst of this chaotic symphony, an island of stillness existed at a small, scarred table in the corner. An old man sat there. He was a study in worn edges and quiet dignity. His knuckles were swollen, the geography of his hands a testament to a long and arduous life. A faint tremor ran through them, a constant, subtle vibration. Yet when his fingers touched the small, polished wooden box on the table before him, the shaking ceased entirely. His touch was sure, steady as a surgeon's. His clothes were simple, a faded flannel shirt, worn soft with countless washings, and dark, clean trousers. They hung loosely on a frame that had once been formidable but was now stooped and thinned by the relentless gravity of years. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, lines etched deep around eyes that held the placid, unblinking quality of a deep, cold well. He seemed less a person and more a geological feature, something that had been there so long it had become part of the landscape, unnoticed and unremarkable. He did not look up. He was focused entirely on the box in his hands. It was no bigger than a deck of cards, made of a dark, rich wood and polished to a dull sheen not by varnish, but by the ceaseless passage of his thumb over its surface. The door to the hall swung open with a percussive bang, letting in a slice of the bright, unforgiving California sun. Through it strode Captain Evan Vance. Vance was the antithesis of the old man. He was a monument to the modern Marine Corps, sculpted from discipline and protein shakes. His digital camouflage uniform was so crisp it looked like it could cut paper. His boots shone with a black, liquid light. He moved with a coiled, predatory grace, his jaw set in a permanent expression of confident challenge. Trailing him were two lieutenants, younger, leaner copies of their captain, their expressions a mixture of admiration and eager sycophancy. They laughed just a little too loudly at a joke Vance had just made, their laughter sharp and brittle in the humid air. Vance's eyes swept the room, a conqueror surveying his domain. He was an officer in force reconnaissance, a title he wore like a second skin, a constant, unspoken declaration of his superiority. He believed in the new Corps. Faster, stronger, smarter. He saw history as a collection of outdated tactics and sentimental stories, irrelevant in the age of drones and data. His gaze landed on the old man in the corner. It was a brief, dismissive glance that quickly hardened into a look of irritation. The old man was an anomaly, a glitch in the perfect, ordered system of the base. He was a smudge of gray in a world of sharp greens and tans. Vance's internal monologue was a low hum of annoyance. Another lost civilian. Probably some retired vet's father wandering over from the family housing units. This was a place for warriors, not a nursing home day room. The sight offended his sense of order. He turned to his lieutenants, a smirk playing on his lips. "Looks like someone's grandpa got lost on his way to the bingo game," Vance said, his voice loud enough to carry over the ambient noise. The two lieutenants snickered on cue. The sound cut through the dull roar of the hall. Several nearby conversations faltered. Young Marines at a nearby pool table paused their game. Cues held midair. The atmosphere in the room shifted, the easy camaraderie tightening into a knot of tension. The old man did not react. He gave no sign that he had heard. His thumb continued its slow, meditative journey across the lid of the wooden box. This utter lack of response was a greater offense to Captain Vance than any retort could have been. It was dismissal. It was irrelevance. His ego, a carefully constructed fortress, felt the first tremor of a siege. He had made a public statement, a display of his casual authority, and it had landed with all the impact of a raindrop in the ocean. The smirk on his face tightened into a sneer. From across the room, Sergeant Reyes watched the scene unfold. Reyes was 32, but a hard 10 years in the Corps had weathered him, giving him the weary eyes of a man much older. He was on his third enlistment, a career infantryman who had seen the deserts of Iraq and the mountains of Afghanistan. He sat nursing a lukewarm soda, the sweet liquid doing little to calm the sour feeling growing in his stomach. He knew Captain Vance. Everyone knew Captain Vance. The officer was a PT stud and a tactical was kid on paper, but he carried an arrogance that set the teeth of most senior enlisted men on edge. He mistook experience for obsolescence and quiet competence for weakness. Reyes's eyes drifted to the old man. He saw what Vance saw: age, frailty, worn clothes. But he also saw something else. He saw the stillness. It was a specific kind of stillness, a profound economy of motion that he had only ever witnessed in a handful of men. They were usually grizzled, leathery-skinned instructors at advanced training schools, men who could kill you with a thumb and whose quietest sentences carried more weight than a general's shout. This old man had that same unnerving calm. It was the placidity of a dormant volcano. A knot of dread tightened in Reyes's gut. This was going to go badly. Vance, feeling the eyes of the room on him, saw his challenge had been implicitly accepted. He could not back down now. He strode toward the corner table, his lieutenants trailing like pilot fish. The metallic taps on his boots clicked sharply on the linoleum floor, each step a declaration of intent. He stopped directly in front of the table, casting a long shadow over the old man. "Hey, Pops," Vance began, his voice dripping with condescension. "I think in the wrong building. This is a United States Marine Corps facility for active duty personnel." The old man slowly, deliberately placed the wooden box on the table. He raised his head. His eyes, clear and startlingly blue, met Vance's. There was no fear in them, no anger, just a quiet, patient weariness. "I'm aware," the old man said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, like stones shifting at the bottom of a river. The simple, factual response infuriated Vance more. He had expected deference, apology, perhaps a bit of confused fumbling. Not this solid, immovable presence. "You're aware?" Vance scoffed, crossing his arms. "Then you're aware you're not supposed to be here. This is a recreation center for the men and women who actually fight, not for visitors." One of his lieutenants chimed in. "Sir, maybe we should call the MPs. Have him escorted off base." Vance held up a hand, enjoying the theater of it all. No, Lieutenant. Let's not trouble the MPs. I'm sure the old-timer can find his own way out." He leaned forward, planting his hands on the table. The posture was pure intimidation. "We're a different breed now, old man. We're faster, more lethal. We fight with drones and satellites. Not like in your day, whatever day that was. Bayonets and bonsai charges, right?" The insult was layered. It mocked his age, his experience, his entire generation. The old man's expression did not change. He simply looked at Vance, his blue eyes seeming to absorb the captain's bluster without reflection. "Some things don't change," the old man said, his voice still a low murmur. "Oh yeah? Like what?" Vance challenged, a cruel grin spreading across his face. "The cost." The single, two-word answer hung in the air, heavy and cold. It was not the answer Vance had been looking for. It was too profound, too simple. It threw his rhythm off. He felt a flicker of uncertainty, which he quickly smothered with more aggression. His eyes dropped to the small wooden box on the table. A new angle of attack. "What's in the box, Gramps?" he demanded, his tone shifting from mockery to suspicion. "Base regulations are pretty clear about bringing unauthorized items into secure areas. For all I know, this could be a security risk." It was a ludicrous accusation, and everyone in the room knew it. But he was an officer. The authority, however misused, was his. The old man's gaze followed Vance's to the box. A flicker of something, the first real emotion Vance had seen, passed through his eyes. It was protective, possessive. "It's a gift," the old man said softly. Vance laughed, a short, ugly bark. "A gift?" For who? You bringing cookies to the troops? Let me see it. He reached for the box. The old man's hand, the one that had been trembling just moments before, shot out and covered the box. It was not a fast movement, but it was perfectly timed, an act of absolute certainty. His hand was now rock steady, the tremor completely gone. His fingers rested firmly on the lid. The two hands, one young and powerful, the other old and gnarled, were inches apart. The air crackled. Sergeant Reyes felt his heart pound against his ribs. He knew this was the turning point. This was where it went from ugly to irreparable. He watched the old man's hand, steady and sure, and a memory surfaced. A memory of his own drill instructor at Paris Island, a man who had seemed ancient even then. A man who had explained that the deadliest weapon a Marine has is his stillness, his ability to wait, to endure, to be the rock against which the enemy breaks. This old man was a rock. Vance saw the protective gesture as defiance. His face flushed a deep, angry red. "That's an order, old man," he hissed, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Show me what's in a box." The old man didn't move. He just held Vance's gaze. "You have no authority to give me that order, son." The word son was like a lit match on gasoline. It was paternalistic. It was dismissive. It flipped the power dynamic Vance had worked so hard to establish. "I am Captain Evan Vance of the United States Marine Corps," he snarled, leaning in so close the old man could smell the coffee on his breath. "I have authority over this entire building and everyone in it. You will show me your identification and you will open that box. Now." The old man sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. He slowly withdrew his hand from the box, a gesture of concession. But his eyes told a different story. They were not defeated. They were waiting. Vance, emboldened, pressed his advantage. "You know, we had legends in my day, too," Vance mocked, his voice rising again for the benefit of the room. "Men with call signs. Real warriors. Not some relic who wanders into the wrong building. What was your call sign, old man? Did you even have one? Bedpan? Geritol?" The lieutenants chuckled nervously. The room was dead silent. The word hung in the air. Call sign. The old man's eyes unfocused for a fraction of a second. The loud, boisterous rec hall dissolved. The smell of pine cleaner and stale coffee was replaced by the thick, metallic scent of blood and the loamy smell of jungle rot. The buzzing neon signs became the incessant whine of mosquitoes. He was 20 years old again, his body a tightly coiled spring of muscle and fear. Rain, thick and warm as blood, plastered his uniform to his skin. He was crouched in a muddy trench, the world outside a nightmare of green tracer fire and the deafening crump of mortar shells. The radio crackled in his ear, a voice frantic and thin with static. "Stations, this is Eagle's Nest. We are being overrun. Position compromised. I repeat, we are being—" The transmission cut to static. His platoon commander, a lieutenant not much older than him, was dead. His sergeant was dead. Everyone in the command post was dead or dying. There were only 5 of them left, cut off, surrounded by a force 10 times their size. They were supposed to be ghosts, a whisper, a recon team, but they had been found. And then came the voice on the command channel. "Calm, cold, almost bored. Eagle's Nest, this is Wraith. I have you." He didn't know who Wraith was. Just a name. A legend whispered about back at Danang. A one-man force who moved through the jungle like a phantom, who appeared and disappeared, leaving only enemy dead in his wake. For the next 4 hours, the voice of Wraith was God. It directed their fire. It told them where the enemy was before they even saw them. It was a calm, steady presence in the heart of chaos. And then, when the final assault came, a wave of bodies charging their position, when he was sure he was about to die, the jungle itself erupted. From the flank, from the rear, from everywhere at once, came the controlled, terrifyingly precise fire of a single rifle. Men dropped. The assault faltered, broke, and then fled. And then silence. Just the rain and the buzzing of insects. Later, a rescue chopper found them. The pilot looked at the 5 survivors and then at the carnage surrounding their position. He just shook his head. Wraith was here, the pilot had said, his voice filled with awe. The old man blinked. The rec hall snapped back into focus. Captain Vance was still standing there, his face a mask of smug impatience. Sergeant Reyes saw the change in the old man's eyes. The brief moment of distance, the flicker of some terrible, ancient memory. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of men who had survived things that should have killed them. He had seen enough. His training, his instincts, his very soul as a Marine screamed at him that a sacred line was being crossed. With movements made discreet by years of practice, he pulled his phone from his pocket beneath the table. His thumb flew across the screen. He didn't call. A call could be overheard. He texted the one man on base who could stop this tidal wave of stupidity. Base Sergeant Major Jacobs. The text was short, precise. SG Timaj. Reyes here. Rec Hall, main building. Captain Vance, FR, is publicly harassing an elderly civilian. Sir, you need to get here now. Something is very, very wrong. He hit send, his heart hammering. He had just gone over an officer's head, straight to the highest enlisted man on the base. It was a career risk, but some things were more important than a career. Up at the table, Vance's patience finally snapped. The old man's silent endurance was a personal affront, a challenge to his very identity. Fine, vanchespat. If you won't show me, I'll see for myself. With a swift, arrogant motion, he snatched the wooden box from the table. The act was so sudden, so aggressive, it drew a collective gasp from the room. It was a physical violation. A line had been crossed. The old man didn't flinch. He simply watched Vance, his expression now one of profound sorrow. He looked down at his empty hands on the table, then back up at the captain. Vance fumbled with the small, intricate latch on the box. His fingers, thick with muscle, were clumsy. He was about to pry it open when the main doors of the recreation hall flew open. They didn't just open. They were thrown open with such force that they slammed against the interior walls, the impact echoing like a gunshot in the suddenly silent room. Every head snapped toward the entrance. In the doorway stood two figures, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun. One was tall and lean, his posture ramrod straight, the single star of a brigadier general gleaming on his collar. The other was shorter, built like a fire hydrant, his chest a billboard of ribbons and medals, the chevrons of the Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton on his sleeve. Sergeant Major Jacobs, and with him, the base commanding general, Brigadier General Miller. The air in the room was sucked out, replaced by a vacuum of pure, unadulterated shock. The low hum of neon, the distant clatter of a plate in the galley, every sound was amplified in the absolute, crushing silence. In an instant, every Marine in the room, from the lowest private to the two lieutenants standing by Captain Vance, snapped to the position of attention. Bodies straightened, heels clicked, hands flattened against trouser seams. It was an instinctive, autonomic response to the presence of gods among mortals. All except two. Captain Vance, who stood frozen, his hand on the wooden box, his face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. And the old man, who remained seated, his quiet stillness now the center of the universe. General Miller's eyes, cold and hard as chips of flint, swept the room. They bypassed the rows of ramrod-straight Marines. They bypassed the terrified lieutenants. They bypassed Captain Vance completely, as if he were a piece of furniture. His gaze locked onto the old man in the corner. Sergeant Major Jacobs took a single, powerful step forward. The two men moved in perfect sync, their boots thudding on the floor with a cadence that spoke of decades of shared service. They did not run. They marched, a direct, unwavering path to the corner table. The crowd of young Marines parted before them like the Red Sea. They stopped beside the table. General Miller looked down at the old man, and the hard, icy mask of his command face melted away. It was replaced by an expression of profound, almost reverent respect. Sergeant Major Jacobs faced the old man, drew his body up to the most rigid, perfect position of attention he had ever held, and rendered a salute so sharp, so precise, it seemed to cut the air. Gunny Croft. The sergeant major's voice boomed, filling the cavernous silence. "It is an honor to see you again, sir." General Miller leaned down, not in a posture of authority, but in one of deference. "Silas," the general said, his voice low and thick with emotion. "We got a message. Are you all right?" The old man, Silas Croft, finally allowed a small, tired smile to touch his lips. "Just a misunderstanding, General," he said, his gravelly voice calm as ever. Vance, meanwhile, felt the world tilt on its axis. "Gunny." "Sir." "Silas." The general, his general, was speaking to this fossil with a deference Vance had never seen him afford a visiting senator. He finally found his voice, a weak, stammering croak. "General, sir," he began. "This man was unauthorized. I was just ascertaining." General Miller turned his head slowly to look at Captain Vance. It was the first time he had acknowledged his existence. The warmth in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold fire that made Vance's blood run like ice water. The general's voice, when he spoke, was no longer warm or emotional. It was quiet. It was lethally precise. "Captain," he said, the word a sliver of ice. "What are you holding?" Vance looked down at his own hand, as if it belonged to someone else. He was still holding the wooden box. It's his, sir. I was securing it." "Give it to me," the general commanded. Vance's hand trembled as he passed the box to the general. General Miller took it with a gentleness that was in stark contrast to his terrifying expression. He held it for a moment, then passed it to the sergeant major. "Sergeant Major," the general said, his eyes never leaving Vance's. "Please, return this to its rightful owner." Sergeant Major Jacobs took the box, turned to Silas Croft, and placed it gently on the table before him. "My apologies, Gunny," he said softly. Silas nodded, his hand immediately coming to rest on the polished wood. The general then took one step closer to Vance. The two lieutenants behind him seemed to shrink, trying to will themselves invisible. "Captain Vance," General Miller began, his voice still terrifyingly quiet. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" "No, sir," Vance whispered, his throat dry. "A civilian, I thought." "A civilian," the general repeated, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. He turned to address the entire silent room. His voice rose, not in a shout, but with a power that commanded absolute attention. "Marines, you are in the presence of Gunnery Sergeant Silas Croft. Retired." The name meant nothing to the younger Marines. But to Sergeant Reyes and a few other seasoned NCOs, it was like a lightning strike. "Croft? That Croft? It couldn't be." The general continued, his gaze sweeping over the young, confused faces. "Some of you may have heard whispers of him in your training. Most of you have not, because his service record is still 70% classified. This man served 30 years in our Corps. He served in the Dominican Republic. He served 2 tours in Vietnam. He was at the siege of Khe Sanh. A murmur went through the NCOs. Khe Sanh was holy ground. At Khe Sanh, the general's voice dropped, becoming a storyteller's cadence. Then Sergeant Croft's reconnaissance platoon was ambushed and cut off. His commander was killed. His senior NCO was killed. For 4 hours, Sergeant Croft single-handedly coordinated the defense of his platoon's position while simultaneously calling in air and artillery support that saved the lives of the 5 men who survived with him. The general paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. He then turned his burning gaze back to Vance. "He has 3 Navy Crosses. He has 4 Silver Stars. He has 7 Bronze Stars for valor." With every medal named, Captain Vance seemed to shrink, his crisp uniform wilting under the verbal onslaught. He was one of the first operators in the unit that would eventually become your beloved Force Reconnaissance, Captain. He wrote half the damn field manuals you probably think are outdated. The general took the small wooden box from the table again. This time, he opened it himself. He turned it so the entire room could see. Nestled on a bed of faded, worn purple velvet was a simple medal. A purple heart. Its ribbon was frayed. The medal itself was dark with age. "This man was wounded in action 11 separate times," the general stated, his voice thick with a rage that was barely contained. "He has bled for this Corps in more countries than you have visited, Captain." He then reached into the box, and carefully lifted the velvet padding. Beneath it lay another medal. It was a 5-pointed star, hanging from a blue ribbon adorned with 13 white stars. The Congressional Medal of Honor. A collective, audible gasp filled the room. It was the sound of 200 young men realizing they were standing on sacred ground. They were looking at a ghost, a living legend. Sergeant Major Jacobs spoke, his voice resonating with history. Operation Silent Talon, 1968. A classified mission to rescue a downed pilot deep in enemy territory. The rescue team was compromised. Gunnery Sergeant Croft, providing overwatch, engaged an enemy force of over 100 soldiers by himself to allow the team and the pilot to escape. He was wounded 3 times, but held his position for 2 hours until his extraction was possible. For his actions, President Nixon awarded him the Medal of Honor in a private ceremony. His call sign on that mission, the sergeant major looked directly at Vance. His eyes filled with contempt, was Wraith. The name landed in the center of the room and exploded. Wraith. Captain Vance's face went from pale to chalk white. He looked as if he'd been physically struck. His own cruel joke, his mockery of call signs, had come back to gut him in front of his entire world. The dramatic irony was a physical force in the room, suffocating him. General Miller's voice dropped back to its lethal, personal whisper. He stepped so close to Vance that their chests were almost touching. "You," the general began, his voice shaking with fury, "in your arrogance and your ignorance, dared to lay hands on this man. You dare to disrespect him. You dare to question his honor in a building that stands on a base that exists because of men like him." "Sir, I didn't know," Vance stammered, his voice cracking. "You don't have to know," the general roared, his control finally breaking. The sound was shocking, a physical blow that made everyone, including the sergeant major, flinch. "You have to respect. That is the first lesson we teach at Paris Island. Respect for the uniform, respect for your elders, respect for the history of this corps. A lesson you have clearly forgotten." He pointed a trembling finger at Vance's chest. "You are a disgrace to the uniform you wear. You are not fit to lead Marines. You are not fit to call yourself 1-inch. The public evisceration was absolute. It was a complete and total annihilation of a man's career and ego in front of his peers, his subordinates, and his superiors. "Captain Vance," the general said, his voice returning to an icy calm, "as of this moment, you are relieved of your command. You are relieved of all duties. Sergeant Major Jacobs will escort you to my office, where you will wait for me. You are confined to your quarters, pending a full Article 32 investigation. I assure you, your career in the United States Marine Corps is over." He turned to the 2 pale-faced lieutenants. "You 2, report to my aide. You will be giving statements. Your fitness to serve as officers will also be reviewed." Sergeant Major Jacobs stepped forward and placed a hand on Vance's arm. It was not a violent gesture, but it had the finality of a closing cell door. Vance, his face a ruin of shame and terror, allowed himself to be led away. He didn't look at anyone. His eyes were fixed on the floor. The 2 lieutenants scurried after them, their faces burning with humiliation. They looked like children being led to the principal's office. As they left, a profound silence settled over the room once more. The general took a deep, steadying breath, the fury draining from his face, leaving him looking tired. He turned back to Silas Croft. "Gunny, on behalf of the Marine Corps, I am so deeply sorry." Silas looked up from his box. He shook his head slowly, a gesture of immense weariness. "He's young, Marcus," he said, using the general's first name. "The Corps forges them in fire. It makes them proud. Sometimes, the pride doesn't leave room for wisdom. He'll learn." The grace in his words, the simple, profound forgiveness, was more stunning than the revelation of his medals. He showed no anger, no desire for vengeance, only a sad, paternal pity. Silas slowly began to push himself up from the chair. His movements were slow, stiff with age. The general and the sergeant major both moved to help him, but he waved them off with a small gesture. He stood, clutching his small wooden box to his chest. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to the general. Then, He turned and began to walk toward the exit. As one, the 200 Marines in the room, from Sergeant Reyes to the youngest private, remained at rigid attention. A silent, perfect corridor formed for him. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the soft scuff of his old shoes on the linoleum floor. The silence was a living thing. It was filled with awe, with shame, with a sudden, profound understanding of the history that walked among them every day, unseen and unheard. He reached the door and, without a backward glance, stepped out into the sun and was gone. The silence he left behind was the loudest sound the room had ever heard. In the weeks that followed, the story of what happened in the rec hall became a base legend. Evan Vance was formally reprimanded and dishonorably discharged after a review board found him unfit for command. He was last heard of working a private security job in a Midwest shopping mall. General Miller, true to his word, instituted a new mandatory training program for all personnel on Camp Pendleton. It was a course on Marine Corps history, heritage, and the importance of humility and respect. It was officially called the Heritage and Valor Program, but everyone on base, from the highest officer to the lowest private, knew it by its unofficial name, the Wraith Protocol. Sergeant Reyes received a quiet, personal commendation from the sergeant major for his courage and good judgment. And far from the noise and rigor of the base, in a small, quiet house filled with the scent of lemon polish and old books, Silas Croft lived his life. He placed the small wooden box back on his mantelpiece. It sat next to a faded black and white photograph of a young woman with a beautiful smile, a woman who had died 50 years before he was awarded the medal he kept hidden beneath the first one he ever received. He rarely looked at them. He didn't need to. Some men carry their greatness like a banner, for all the world to see. Others carry it like a stone, its weight known only to them, its value beyond measure.